Welcome. I'm Liz Taylor, ocean explorer, naturalist, and entrepreneur.
I'm Sylvia Earle. I'm an oceanographer, founder of Mission Blue, National Geographic explorer, and I'm an ocean elder. Thank you, Ocean Elders, for sponsoring this program.
Absolutely. And this is our show, Dive In, where we host informal and open conversations with the ocean community on topics of wonder and interest. We're glad to be back and hope everyone has made some time to get outdoors. You can ask questions as we go through the conversation by putting them in the Q&A box, and we'll answer as many as we possibly can. And there'll be some links as well shared along the way. Before we get underway, let's remind everyone that the world
is
blue.
blue.
I'm going to try to start sharing my screen. And today we are very excited to have Dr. James Buddy Powell joining us to talk about his decades of work with the manatees. In addition to being the executive director of the Clearwater Marine Aquarium and Research Institute, Buddy is the Chief Zoological Officer for the Marine Research Division and helps to protect manatees and their habitats worldwide. Welcome, Buddy.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the time to be with you here this afternoon.
Oh, look at that.
Look at this guy.
That's as though he's flying.
Your relationship with manatees goes back at least 4 decades. How did the manatees first get your attention?
Well, it's an interesting story. Like Sylvia, I grew up on the west coast of Florida. And when I was a teenager, I had a boat. And the story goes that I used to row my grandma around in that boat. And when she passed away, she left some money to my parents and said, buy Buddy a boat with a motor on it, which actually changed the trajectory of my life because out on the water, I ran across this guy named Woody Hartman, who was the first to sort of study manatees in the wild, a pioneer in manatee research. And he sort of took me, as his volunteer assistant, but I think he really coveted my boat because in that boat you see in this slide, it would take him like 3 hours to get down the river. It'd take me about 20 minutes. And so he got a personal guide and he got a boat that could take him to all these places. And I was just fascinated by what he could teach me about all the animals and also as we both kind of became friends and friendly with manatees. Back then, people didn't even really know that they were here in Crystal River. We only had about 40 or so of them. So it goes back to when I was a young teen.
Oh, look at these guys.
Oh,
yeah, so back then, Crystal River, like it says here, was a manatee happy place. There was an exotic vegetation that was introduced accidentally called hydrilla into Crystal River. And Crystal River is a spring-fed river, which means the water is coming from the ground. Out of the ground, it stays a constant temperature of about 73 degrees. So manatees would come in to stay warm during the winter when the Gulf of Mexico temperature dropped, and they would also find a lot of food there. And so they basically had everything they needed to survive cold temperatures. Manatees are primarily a tropical animal. So to be able to survive these cooler temperatures at this northern extent of their range, they have to find warm water. And so Crystal River provided that sanctuary. And it's interesting because times have changed, and we can talk about that a little bit more later on.
This is the Manatee Spa.
Manatee Spa, indeed. So we realized at the time, after he sort of finished doing his research, he went back to Cornell to write up his Ph.D. But while he was here, we were discussing, there's really no other place like this in the world, as far as we knew, that manatees came in these numbers in Clearwater. So we proposed, and I was kind of left behind here in Crystal River as he went back up north. And so we proposed to the county commission back in 1969 that Kings Bay, Crystal River, should be made a sea cow sanctuary. So that's me in that old newspaper article with my boat with a motor. And when we proposed it, the county commission said, no, it's going to have a negative economic impact on our community. We're not interested. And so if you've been to Crystal River in recent years, you'll know, well, they got it wrong and we got it right, because now manatees are the driving economic factor for this area, with hundreds of thousands of people that come visit.
Right? It's just like with when you turn it around with whales, or and you know they're so much more valuable alive than and being looked
Exactly.
at.
Yeah.
And tarpon.
Tarpon.
Crystal River was
Yeah.
also famous attractant, but not for live tarpon, for dead tarpon.
That's right. Crystal River and Homosassa both were very famous for that. So Hartman, when he went back, he also wrote an article for National Geographic, and this was kind of the first article for people in general to sort of learn about these mysterious animals. You know, people sort of referred to them as sea cows back then. And so when he wrote this article, it really began the impetus for people to become more interested in them, including Jacques Cousteau, who read this article in National Geographic and then came to Crystal River in the 1970s. And Hartman said, "Oh, get a hold of this kid, Buddy, in Crystal River. He'll take you out." So they did, and so I spent like a year with him and his crew primarily as they did the first documentary on manatees. And that's really what changed things. As a consequence of that documentary, the state of Florida created Blue Springs State Park, and there was more interest in trying to protect them overall. And then, of course, they were protected by in the early 70s by the Federal Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act. So it's sort of interesting. Like I said before, people kind of referred to them as sea cows. But there's this linkage between, these unusual animals with mermaids. And when Columbus first came to the New World, he spied off the coast of Dominican Republic. And this photo actually was taken in Cuba. Says when the admiral was going to the Rio del Oro, he said he saw 3 mermaids which came up very high out of the sea, but they were not as beautiful as they had been painted. But to some extent, they were like a man in the face. So this is probably what they saw from their vessel in the 1400s.
Yeah, and they've been at sea a very long time, right?
That's right. They've been at sea for a very long time. So, you can see there's a lot of resemblance here between mermaids and manatees. The manatees on the left there. So, yeah. So this photo was actually taken in Weeki Wachee, which is very famous place here, one of the old Florida attractions where they would put on this mermaid show. But Weeki Wachee is another spring-fed river. And it attracts manatees for the same reasons as Crystal River, to stay warm. So this manatee showed up, I guess, when one of these mermaid performers were there. But what I really wanted to, pay attention here is their order, scientific order is Sirenia, which comes from the word sirens, mermaids. So again, even in the scientific literature, there's this linkage with manatees and mermaids.
Yeah, the sirens.
That's right. There you go.
And they're just, what is their lineage? What's sort of their close land relatives?
Yeah, it's pretty cool because people think, about whales and dolphins and, maybe even manatees being related, but it's only because they live in the water. But manatees' closest living, manatees have a common ancestor with elephants, surprisingly. And that common ancestor was more likely sort of the semi-aquatic, hippopotamus, perhaps in nature type of animal. And then the two offshoots from that common ancestor, some went dry and some went wet, where you've got the elephants and the Sirenia. But they're also part of this very unusual group of animals called Panicculata, which the elephants are part of. But they also, and we know this genetically, share common ancestors with aardvarks and hyrax, for
Huh.
example.
And that earlier one almost looked like a tapir in a way.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Well, you kind of see it with the paddles.
The
on
foot.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And which so manatees, there's another relative in a different family called a dugong, which actually has tusks, but they don't protrude. So you can see some of these common characteristics. And just as you said, if you look at the flippers on manatees, they have fingernails, which is,
Just looking at that, so
elephants'
interesting.
toenails.
Yeah.
and I sort of look at it too. If you look at their muzzle, which has very muscular, it's like a short trunk. They use it for grasping vegetation and hanging on things. This guy's sort of hanging on to somebody's shirt,
It
but
says
they'll
ripping
use
the
it for
tanks
feeding.
off.
Looked edible to me.
Yeah, it's green. Oh,
They're such big puffballs.
they
They're just
are.
so gentle.
So yeah, they really are, appropriately named sometimes as those gentle giants. And so with regards to manatees, there's actually three species. There's the West Indian manatee, which is the one that we have here, which is comprised of two subspecies, the Florida manatee and the Antillean manatee, which is found along the coast of South America and the Greater Antilles. And then you have the Amazonian manatee, which is found in the Amazon River and the tributaries. And then the African manatee, which I actually went over to study for a number of years, which is found along the west coast of Africa. And then they're in the family called Trichicidae. But then there's another critter which way back in times that was much more widely distributed in both the Atlantic and the Pacific, but now it's only restricted to the Indo-Pacific, and that's called the dugong. And it's much more, it's marine. It's also an herbivore. It's got a flute tail like a dolphin.
Just
You can
noticed
see
that,
these up.
yeah.
And they're really remarkable animal too.
Hey, look at this book here.
Yeah. So where does the extinct sea cow from Alaska fit in?
We're going to get to that next.
Yeah, so there's the Stellar sea cow, which got up to be about 30 feet long, which was a cold water sirenian. And it was first recorded, by naturalists, stellar in the Bering Sea in the northern Pacific. Now, it had probably been hunted by Aboriginal people for quite some time, but Stellar was a naturalist that was shipwrecked with Bering, and they were able to get off the island where they were shipwrecked, but he brought back news of this animal that fed primarily on kelp and algae. And so sealers and whalers and folks hunting sea otters would stop at the island and continue to hunt them for their meat and oil. And just, roughly 17 years after they were first recorded by science, which was in the late 1700s, they were hunted to extinction.
That is shocking. It's
But
just,
they're so vulnerable
yeah.
because they're curious, they're gentle,
That's
they're
right.
and they eat plants or grazers. So they just had not had enemies like humans.
Does
Were
it say
they-
they always the slow and tasty
Yeah.
are the ones that have gone extinct first?
It said Wilson, the large, the slow, and the tasty.
Large,
Yeah.
slow, and tasty. Yeah,
And now we're
that's
not limiting our appetites to
no. But it's shocking to have,
tuna are fast and herring are small.
but to see an animal like
Krill.
this, because completely wiped from the face of the earth in that short of a time
Yes.
span. It's just,
Humans,
yeah,
well,
In just a very short period of time, and they were just so, as you said, they were close to shore, slow and sluggish. They really didn't have any enemies, and so they just didn't know what to do.
yeah.
Like the dodo bird or something, just let them. They were just taken.
I think the indigenous people did eat them, but
Yeah,
there's a certain ethic that when you're dependent on something for food, you don't take them all. It's a bad recipe for existence. But when the Europeans came, there was
No holds barred.
nothing to inhibit them. They weren't
No.
dependent. They were just there, and they had a monetary value, which is sadly how we're looking at a lot of ocean life today. But look at that face. How could you want to harm a face like that?
I know.
Yeah, so they were, they're well adapted for their aquatic life. They're sort of torpedo shaped, and they use those flippers to walk along the bottom. They've got sort of little flaps that cover, their nostrils. And that beaver-like tail, it's very flexible. It moves a lot, and it allows them to really be able to maneuver well, in a fairly enclosed, very small area. It's amazing how quickly they can just kind of turn or navigate under logs and around in river and creek systems.
Buddy, before we get into this, I want to know, have you ever been hugged by a manatee?
Oh yeah. It's been I can certainly say that over the years I have been uh, hugged and grabbed upon by manatees and dunked under the water. It's like, okay, you can let go of me now. Get a breath of air. But yeah, no, absolutely. It's growing up here in Crystal River. I've actually gone full circle. I live back in Crystal River now, and it was just a remarkable place to grow up and have these animals right here in my backyard. And the fact now that here I am, a scientist, and 50 plus years later, I still get excited every time I see one.
Of course you do.
Absolutely.
Well, I think there are kind of regulations. You're not supposed to go out of your way to hug them, but hey,
If they come to you.
Yeah, so like I said, back in the day, when we were out there and there weren't so many divers and so forth, we were definitely a source of curiosity that they would come up and muzzle you and grab you. But as you said, they are a protected species, and we really want people to observe them passively and not try to touch them or grab onto them or anything like that.
So this kind of connects all the DNA of the different populations.
Yeah, so this kind of just gives you an idea. We were talking about the different species. So this Florida manatee only has a single haplotype, but you can which is that green circle, but you can kind of see this diversity of manatees around the rest of the Caribbean. And we're learning more and more some interesting things that we didn't know before. People quite often will say, well, you've been studying them for so long, what's the most interesting thing? Well, we have, but we started out as generalists, but students and so forth are diving deeper into their genetics and their behavior and other aspects of their biology. And I mean, one of the things to this day that's just fascinating to me is we have animals, or you'll watch, manatees as they go through rivers and tributaries where the water is not clear. It's very, very turbid, but they have a road map. They know exactly where they're going. They'll cut the corners. They'll make a right turn into this little tributary and swim up and feed on this little bunch of grass that's growing there, and then come back to the spring. How do they do that?
Yeah.
We don't. Or we have manatees in Belize that we've tagged on offshore coral atolls that will come inshore and go across deep oceanic blue water. We have manatees now or at least one that we know about, because we can identify them from their scars, that went to Cuba and came back again.
Wow.
How did they do that? Before we thought they had to stick, very close to shore, and they would navigate that way. But so there's still so much to learn.
Right.
So do most of the manatees that you kind of monitor there in Florida, do they stick around that area pretty tightly, or will they just kind of take off and migrate to points south or go down to Cuba or beyond?
Well, like I said, there's a photo identification catalog with thousands of manatees over the years that we've collected. And so we can kind of monitor and track where they go. And some of those animals have shown up in Cuba. There's been two at least that have shown up in the Yucatan in Mexico, which was kind of unheard of before. And what it does is that through that photo identification, it allows us to be able to also monitor, females and reproduction, over time. And and we do know that they'll come to Florida, spend the winter in Florida to stay warm, but during warmer months, they'll disperse. The manatees in Crystal River, quite a few of them we know from both satellite tagging and also the scars are in Mobile, Alabama, and further west. And we have animals on the East Coast that now, perhaps it's related to climate change or going up and to the to Georgia and the Carolinas. We were just up in Georgia last week, satellite tagging animals because there are protections in Florida, state protections, but once you get outside of Florida, there are none. They're federally protected, but there's no speed zones and things like that. So that's what our data is being used for. We think one of the reasons why they do move up the coast, the East Coast during warmer months, is that they're herbivores, vegetarians, and so they'll feed on submergent vegetation, but they'll also feed on emergent vegetation along watercourses. This guy's helping somebody mow his lawn, but it's grass that's growing in these salt marshes. They'll be potentially following that flush of new grass that's very nutritious, and they'll just keep moving up the coast until it turns cold, and then they'll turn around and come back again.
Have they made it to the Bahamas, buddy?
Yes. Yeah, we have Florida manatees that have made it to the Bahamas, and we think actually there's the beginning or perhaps the reestablishment of manatees in the Bahamas over the past few decades.
That vast seagrass
That's
area.
right. They do like areas that have a source of fresh water, so they're somewhat limited by that. They don't absolutely have to have fresh water, but you seem to find them around sources of fresh water and brackish areas too.
Don't they, after rain, kind of use their big lips to get fresh water up near the surface?
You're absolutely right. They do that. You will, like in Belize, in some of these mangrove islands, you'll find them inside, like in these little lagoons inside these mangrove islands, and after a heavy rain, they'll be right there at the surface, just getting that freshwater layer right off the top. In fact, you can hear them slurping as they're taking a hit of fresh water. It's
That's
pretty
really interesting, to think it's like an aquatic mammal, but they still need to drink fresh water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unlike whales that have physiological adaptation to staying in.
And then there's
saltwater.
this kind of behavior, which
Yeah.
I remember last year that like someone called the police in Florida because they saw this going on.
Yeah, so manatees are unusual. Going back to what we were talking about before, is that they're one of the few marine mammals that can move from fresh to salt water, and they do have some of these adaptations to be able to do that too. But they certainly do prefer the fresh water. But yeah, you're right. I mean, manatees, the female will come into estrus, just like a dog comes into heat. She's secreting hormones in the water. The males are able to detect those hormones and then track her down, and she'll start collecting, these group of suitors, sometimes as many as 20, and they will stay with her for a couple of weeks until she's ready to mate. She gets a little tired of being followed everywhere she goes. And this photograph, and this, as you were saying, Liz, before, there will be phone calls that came at manatees in distress, but it's really the female, beaching herself just to get away from the males.
It's just like a mallard hen, right? If those males just like persistent and they've got to get away
Yeah,
from them.
absolutely.
Does that one have some scars from a?
Yeah, so you can see the one on the right, and also it looks like the female that's kind of in the center there, scars from where it's been hit by a boat. And those almost, nearly all the animals have some scar from where they've been hit by a boat.
That
Yes,
has to be, that has to be new because, well, certainly it's new in their history, but you think about when I first enjoyed exploring the Florida Springs, it was by canoe or on a tire, inner tube.
inner tube, yeah.
And
Right. Yeah.
motorboats just seem so wrong in those beautiful, clear rivers. It just seems odd that just in a few decades they have become normal instead of never. And the damage done to these creatures, there's nothing in their history that prepares them for that kind of speed or danger. I mean, they might be scraped by the bottom of a canoe, but that would not cause damage.
Yeah, that's exactly right. They were first protected in Florida in the 1800s
Hmm.
because of hunting pressure. Um, and
Yeah.
then um,
Yeah.
and then boats and motorboats came along, and people go, oh, they don't, get out of the way, they don't hear them. Well, I have done literally thousands of hours of aerial surveys, and I can tell you that the number of encounters that these manatees have with boats, and we've done studies of this, looking at how many times a boat comes close or, over a manatee, and it's unbelievable that we don't see more dead and injured manatees. And there was a recent paper that came out that we talk about manatees being killed by boats, but those sublethal massive injuries of broken bones and lacerations, what sort of impact does that have on, the health of these animals and reproduction and so forth? We don't really know, but it has to. It's hard to
One,
believe these animals survive these injuries.
Misery.
yeah. So
Yeah.
what's going on in this?
Yeah, so this is the female will mate. Gestation is about 13 months. She'll typically have a single young, sometimes twins, about 5% of the time. So this is a mom with probably about a 2-year calf, which would be about the time that the calf would wean, and it's nursing right there in the axile of the flipper, which is also something similar with elephants too, that the teeth is located right there at the base of the leg in elephants too. So it's another one of these characteristics. So he or she will, nurse for a couple of years, and then will leave, and then she'll recycle back in, and it'll be so the calving rate is very slow, like 2.5, 3 years, or even longer. And
Wow.
if she's hit by a boater, it could be even longer than that.
Yeah. Yeah. If they're stressed.
I wonder if they shared space with the monk seals.
Oh, the Caribbean monk seal. Yeah.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
last one
So,
was seen.
so I don't know if you can. This is a video. I don't know if it'll play or
Oh,
not. One of the things that manatees have are these sparse hairs all over their body, including their flippers. That is one tiny little hair on the flipper of a manatee. SB biologist is tickling it with.
yeah, you can see it's like woo. Yeah.
So that is just an indicator that all these hairs are like a giant sensory organ, like a lateral line in a fish, and those those hairs are very particular in that they have nerve endings,
Right one.
and we think that manatees use this like a lateral line in a fish to detect, vibrations in the water and so forth. So this is just kind of a funny little video to show just how sensitive
Yeah.
um, those hairs are, and what biologists will do.
Up and touching your arm.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. So as I mentioned before, they've got to stay, manatees in Florida are at the northern extent of the range, and so they have to stay warm. So they go into these natural springs, like Crystal River and Homosassa and Blue Springs on the St. Johns River. But it's because the water stays the same temperature all year round, like around 73. So when the river temperature, ocean temperature, Gulf drops down below that, then they'll start moving into these springs. But they've also move into power plants and industry plants as well to stay warm.
I had no idea there were so many power plants.
Yeah. And it's an interesting conservation conundrum when you think about it, that these manatees have become dependent on this warm water. But if you shut it off now, because of all the development along the state, where are they going to go to stay warm? So that earlier picture was in Crystal River at Three Sisters, which is a natural spring, which I'm going to show you in another photo too. The next one is a power plant down near West Palm called Riviera. This is how we also count manatees during the height of the winter. We'll fly around airplanes and take photographs and count them like jelly beans in a jar. So there's close to 500 manatees in this photo.
It's unbelievable.
Manatees like manatees.
Yeah,
That's
well, they
right.
like water.
Yeah.
It's like everybody at the county pool, you know.
Yeah. So if they can't find warm water, then they'll suffer from cold stress syndrome. And it's basically their blood gets shunted to their, interior organs to stay warm, just like we get frostbite.
Mhm.
The same thing happens to them. They'll get these ulcerations or this halo around their tail. And if they stay cold, then they'll succumb to pneumonia or some other. They'll kind of just shut down. And very often, these are the animals that we have to rescue during the wintertime.
Is it kind of like almost having a hypothermia situation for them?
That's right. Yeah.
Are those rings on the tail from entanglement?
It. No, the rings on the tail is from cold. It's necrotic tissue, just like you get frostbite and you may lose fingers and toes. That that ring around the tail will eventually, the tissue will become necrotic, and some of it will actually slough off and fall off, and it creates this this undulated, margin to the tail.
Wow.
So we were talking earlier about, how manatees move around during the winter. They come into these springs and power plants to stay warm. And we really thought that they did not travel across oceanic water. But back in 2007, we've had a manatee project in Cuba for about 20 years now. So one of my students, who's now gone on and gotten her PhD, she said, "Oh, there's a manatee out here at one of the power plants." So she went out, or someone took photographs of it and brought the photographs back. And I said, "I think I know that manatee." And she goes, "I think you're crazy." And we brought the photographs back and ran it into that program that I was telling you about earlier. And sure enough, it was a manatee I had first photographed in Crystal River in 1979.
Wow.
You've got a good memory.
Yeah.
And well, to me, it's like my friends, many of them you can recognize by these scars. And it just looked very familiar to me. And sure enough, that's what it was. And that was the first known case. Now we have several that have moved from Florida to Cuba, and now we have at least one individual that's come back again. She actually went down with a calf. She had been seen the summer before up in the Wacula River with a little calf, newborn calf, and then it was the following winter that she was seen down in Cuba with that. That's a photograph of it with like a 6 months old calf.
Yeah, older one.
So the way that the migration, the connection between Alaska and Hawaii of the humpback whales
Yeah, with the gray
was
whales.
by the
Oh,
pattern of natural pattern on their flukes, on the underside of their flukes. I guess if you probably have seen enough of these creatures, even without the scars, that you recognize individuals because their faces are distinctive. But
Yeah, you're right. If you look at a close up, we actually tried to do this at one time. Those wrinkles along their muzzles is almost like a fingerprint, but sadly, most of them also have these bigger scars.
Yeah.
So what if they're not to, encounter something bad? What is their sort of typical lifespan of these guys?
Well, one of the ways that you can age them, you can't really age them while they're still alive, but their ear bones, to a degree, if there's a dead one, you can take that ear bone and cut it just like you do an otolith with a fish, and then stain it and then you can see the annual rings in it. When an animal gets really old, those rings begin to compress, so it's harder to do it. But there was one in captivity called Snooty in Bradenton that lived to be 69 years old.
Wow.
And so there are individuals, in Florida that they've been able to age using ear bones of over 50. And there's at least one manatee here in Crystal River uh, that I've known since I was a kid. And
Amazing.
she's still out there, and there may be another one too. I'm not really sure.
But they do have threats, don't they?
They do. So just kind of looking at threats and what the threats were here way back in the day in Florida. This is actually where I was working in Africa, where they're still hunted for meat and for their hides. So they're harpooned. This is actually that lower right hand picture is a manatee trap. They bait
Oh,
it with vegetation. The manatee swims in it. They eat the vegetation. It's a big box trap, and then there's a door that has a rock on it. And then that photograph over in the left was taken in Guinea-Bissau. That's me walking out there, and it's low tide, but there's a freshwater seep spring, and that's a platform. So at night, the hunter will be up in that platform, and he puts sticks all around it. And so the manatee comes in to drink that fresh water. He'll see the sticks separate, and then sadly dispatch it with a harpoon.
sad.
Not fair.
No.
So as we were sort of talking about earlier, manatees were first protected in the 1800s from hunting, but now it's boats and it's human-related causes for the most part. This is like from 74 to 22, and it pretty hasn't really changed much in the past couple of years. But you can see that about 20% of the manatee deaths are caused by watercraft. Another category is perinatal, which is sort of the young calves that come in, and then crushed in gates and salinity dams and locks. But what we are seeing, and kind of the point I want to make, is that we're beginning to see that other sort of close to 25% part of this pie is natural and cold. And we're seeing something change over time in these recent years. That the 22% that's unidentified just to decompose the carcass, and others are unrecovered. They just couldn't get to the carcass.
Yeah.
So this kind of gives you an idea. Manatees are, sadly hit by boats, killed by boats, seriously injured. The lacerations, of course, from the prop, but sometimes you'll find a manatee dead and it hardly has a scar on it. But what's happened, it's been hit by that lower unit, that crankcase of the engine, and blunt trauma, just that force of the strike will break bones, and the bones will puncture an internal organ or something like that. So people think, oh, it's propellers that kill manatees. No, it's propellers, the shaft, or some combination thereof.
Yeah.
It's a wonder they don't die from infection, especially
Yeah,
considering.
that's something that's pretty interesting about manatees. Their blood coagulates very quickly, and they have this remarkable healing ability that probably because of predation, and that has helped them certainly to survive some of these strikes. So this gives you an idea of manatee deaths since it was first sort of recorded. But what you can kind of see is that these categories of quote unquote natural, and that's not really fair to say, because things are changing in their habitat, climate change. So you're seeing this proportion of deaths and over time, and also rescues go up. And that's because, when you think about it as a conservationist, your tools in your toolbox for protecting manatees, we know that manatees are caused by, watercraft strikes. Well, you can slow boats down. You can create sanctuaries for them. But now what we're seeing is habitat change, environmental change. And over the past few years, we've had literally thousands or 1,000 manatees die over on the east coast of Florida, which was about how many manatees we thought there was when I first started studying them. And this is caused by plankton blooms. It's complex. These blooms, because of nutrients flowing into the system and not a lot of flushing, decreases the water visibility, which decreases the light. The seagrass, just like any grass, needs light to grow. And because it's being shaded out by the plankton blooms, it's been this dramatic dieback of seagrass. So when manatees were coming into this power plants there to stay warm, they go, "Where's the buffet? The food's gone." And so they ended up starving to death, or becoming emaciated, like that other photograph that earlier photograph where they have to be rescued.
That's that one.
Yeah, that one. You can see the ribs on that animal. That animal had already been rescued, and I think that was like a week or two later. You're still not seeing it recovering, but I think that animal actually did recover and was released back to the wild.
Well, there's a connection. The manatees, of course, generate manatee poop, which is just exactly what the seagrasses need. What we put in the water is not exactly what the seagrasses require for their to be thriving.
Do they also experience some stress from just like, because obviously they come up and are breathing near the surface? Are they getting some of that, like, people always complain about how the red tide makes their eyes burn and their lungs burn, and they must be affected.
Yeah. So that's a really good point, because what we're describing here with those manatee deaths is different than what we see over on the West Coast. This is just an algal bloom that's not necessarily has neurotoxin like red tide does. Red tide on the West Coast, the organism itself has a neurotoxin that can kill manatees directly. And just as you were saying, they can inhale it right at that water-air interface, or even after the red tide event is kind of diminished a bit, those red tide organisms, drift to the bottom, cover the seagrass, and as they go along and feed, they're ingesting it as well. And many years ago, we actually had manatees that had tunicates in their stomach that they probably picked up as they were feeding. Well, those tunicates are filter feeders. So it was like little cyanide pills as they were eating.
Well,
Poor things.
there's also, isn't there a connection with sea turtles that are also greens anyway, are grazers? And they're a natural part of the system. And again, there's the nutrient cycle that they process the grass, it goes back into the system in just the right kind of fertilizer that the seagrasses and the phytoplankton, for that matter, we have disrupted key elements, even the fish that have been taken away, and the mullet that once were so abundant. I mean, there's still mullet, but nothing like the scale, that the numbers that were there even 50 years ago, let alone 500,000.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And they're recycling those plants that belong there. It's not, phosphates and other things that are coming from runoff necessarily. And the other thing is, as manatees are feeding, they're causing different aged seagrass. So you've got new growth with, nutritious that opens that up to pinfish and other things to feed on, or little shrimp and other critters that are food for other animals. So they do play, like green sea turtles, a very important role in the ecosystem. This slide just shows you that seagrass dieback since 2010, after those algal blooms started. So you can kind of go on to the next slide. It'll just
Yeah. Whew. Shocking.
and yeah, so this is by St. John's River Water Management District that monitors the seagrass over there. So this is what it was like before 2010. And then the next slide, I think. Yeah. So that was just a couple of years ago, that along that same transect. So you can see the difference. There is some slight recovery. The good news is there is some slight recovery going on now. And what manatees did, it sort of opened up. Everyone knew about this problem to a large extent, but when manatees began dying by the hundreds, it really brought attention to this issue. So there's been additional resources put into, projects to try to clean up both on land, but also the lagoon itself. It got so bad that actually, and this was very experimental, that with donations, they actually started feeding manatees lettuce in a very controlled way. You didn't want, everyone and their brother out throwing
Well, I
lettuce.
think that it happened in some areas. They were feeding them sweet potatoes and lettuce and
Yeah.
everything.
So they are protect. Again, I have to say that, it's you can't do that.
No,
They
I
are,
know.
but the state and the feds, they did, start feeding them in these areas where they were particularly at risk. So I just kind of wanted to come full circle back here in Crystal River, that because of so much interest in manatees over the years, from those early documentaries, from those days back in the 60s, Crystal River now is a national wildlife refuge specifically for manatees.
That's got to be really a rewarding feeling to finally see it come through.
Right.
It is. Yeah.
Oh,
So some of the things the refuge has been doing, that photograph over to the left, the one I showed you earlier, this is the same place now. This was just taken this past winter, and where they've tried to restore some of the vegetation, restore some of the flow from the spring. But you can see this sanctuary that's been created, and the manatees are staying on one side, and look at all the people and the kayaks on the other side. And so this is really important because these sanctuaries provide a place where manatees can come rest and stay warm. People get the wrong impression that every manatee is friendly and tame. This is proof right here that's not the case. If given the option to avoid people, they will. Now, it's this double-edged sword, because those early documentaries and National Geographic articles really what brought attention and awareness to the plight of manatees that resulted in, the protections and sanctuaries. So we're going to jump across the pond to Belize, where we've been working for 20 plus years. And it's kind of an interesting work there, because we first went there 20 plus years ago, because we wanted to go someplace where manatees didn't have to deal with boats so much and didn't have to stay warm in the wintertime. So, and we started working there because we really wanted to find out what manatees really do in most areas. In most of the
They really look like they're hanging out here.
So same thing. We've been monitoring this population. Excuse me.
Sip of water, just like a manatee. That's good. It helps everyone.
So we've had a long-term study there, again, to look at reproduction and but the interesting part of it is that there was a young guy like myself who kind of came out and wanted to become part of our work, and he was just a young teen. And he was so small at the time, I wouldn't let him go out. I was afraid to get hurt. But just like I kind of took up with this guy Hartman, this guy Jamal Galvez in Belize, as a young kid, was just absolutely passionate about manatees. And his career as well has continued. He was just from a local village there. And he's worked with us and, the biologists. And I'm proud to say that just recently he got his master's degree at UC Santa Cruz.
Yay.
Now gone back to Belize, and you'll see him on social media all over the place. And he's become quite the celebrity, both in Belize, but also internationally, and has brought a tremendous amount of attention to trying to protect manatees in Belize.
That's so outstanding. That's just wonderful. There he is.
There he is. And so one of the things we're doing in Belize, when we first went there, like I said, 20 years ago, you wouldn't find a manatee with boat scars. They were clean. But now as we've been seeing, there's been more and more manatees that are hit by boats, or entangled in fishing gear.
Yeah.
And so we're actually building, and the government of Belize has given us some funding to start a rescue and rehab facility in Belize. A number of years ago, there really wasn't a need, but there is a need now.
Yeah,
There
and
is.
there certainly is a need in Florida. Here's your
Yeah, so Clearwater Marine Aquarium, we're very happy and proud to say we've been involved with manatee rescue and transports for many, many years. And the other thing that our team does is that once they have been rehabilitated, they're released back out to the wild. It's kind of they're getting their if you go to the hospital, the doctor says, "Oh, come back in 2 weeks and I'll give you a checkup." Manatees don't do that. We have to tag them and track them and monitor them, and that's one of the things that our team does. But now with this new pool and facility that we're building in Clearwater, we're part of something called the Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnership, which is 20 plus facilities in Florida and also in Ohio. It takes a village. We're all playing a part of trying to rescue and rehabilitate these animals and getting them back out into the wild. And so we're very happy that we're soon going to be able to do, the whole shebang, everything from the rescue to the rehabilitation to monitoring them once they go back out.
That's amazing. We have a few minutes left, so we're gonna go and grab up some of the questions.
Are there further slides?
I think
Or
we're at the last one, but
get through them all?
yeah.
Good.
So Emily is asking, she says, I am currently camping in Manatee Springs. This morning, my husband and I witnessed manatees swimming in the spring. My question is, how much seagrass has been lost around Crystal River and the surrounding areas? And are there any reforestation programs?
That's a really good question, and I will tell Emily that Manatee Springs got its name because of manatees there, but they were pretty much hunted out. And you can go back and read a book by Bartram in the 1700s. And it's only been within the past 30 years or so that manatees have reestablished themselves from pioneers from Crystal River.
Mhm.
But to get to your question, so I showed that photograph of all that grass in Crystal River, which was an exotic. And then there was a series of storms, and salt water came up the river and basically wiped it out. And so for many years, there wasn't any vegetation particularly growing in Kings Bay and Crystal River. And then they did start a restoration project, which was very successful. They introduced a type of eelgrass, and it flourished for about 3 years, and manatees had all this food. But just recently, a hurricane and flooding events, the salt water pulse has come up the river again and wiped it out. So again, we're right back to where it was before. We're also seeing with sea level rise, that salt water is penetrating, and staying longer up in Crystal River. You're seeing barnacles grow right up by the spring, which it was not the case when I was a kid. And they've tracked the salinity. So even though there's been these restoration projects, it was temporarily successful. So now what are we going to do?
So the freshwater, is that Vallisneria? It looks like
It's Vallisneria, yeah.
turtle. It is distinctly freshwater.
Yeah.
But turtle grass, and there are 3 or 4 other kinds of seagrasses
Seagrasses.
that seem to tolerate a pretty wide range. Not
Yeah.
not totally fresh, but
Brackish.
brackish.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think that's probably what they're going to have to rethink, is that this particular variety of eelgrass, the Vallisneria that they planted, was a little bit, the first attempt was a complete failure. The second attempt was pretty good. It was a little bit more salt tolerant, but when you got that pulse of salt water coming up, it wiped it out.
Yeah.
So as you're saying, I mean, there's polydule, there's some other sort of estuarine species that are more salt tolerant that they may have to think about, which manatees love, either naturally or with a restoration process is going to.
Actually called manatee grass.
That's right. Yeah,
Convenient.
It's Serengodium cynodosia.
that's right.
All right. Kaki is saying, how do you feel about manatee and human interaction and the current laws? Are they too strict, too lenient, or what do you think about it?
What's the balance?
What's the balance?
Well, like I mentioned before, I can certainly say, back in the day, that sort of human interaction with manatees in Crystal River, which has become quite the mecca for people to come see them, was beneficial in getting the public awareness, which led to political will to try to protect them. However, if you go out there now, there are times when you can hardly, take a boat to get close to where they're coming to try and stay warm. Thankfully, there are those sanctuaries, like I showed in that earlier photograph. But I certainly think that we have to be very careful, as we very often get ourselves in that type of, situation that we, kill or disrupt or disturb the goose that laid the golden egg. And so these animals have as development increases around the state of Florida, we have to do more, certainly voluntary compliance, but there needs to be those rules and regulations for people to understand that manatees have as much right to our waterways and springs and so forth as we think we do.
Well,
Yeah.
maybe even more. They
Yeah.
got here first.
Yeah, they were here first. Yeah, exactly.
We're loving them to death in a way.
Exactly.
That's right.
Jamie is asking, are the algal blooms caused by the Army Corps of Engineers release of water from Lake Okeechobee? Will the new reservoir that's being built and the resulting change of water flows help the situation?
Yeah, so where we're talking about, it's interesting because there's different issues around the state of Florida. What we can certainly say is that water quality and diminishing water quality is an issue around the entire state of Florida, and then having different impacts in different ways. So that situation on the East Coast, as compared to red tide on the West Coast, as compared down in southern Florida, where there are these cyanobacteria and algal blooms and nutrients that are coming out of Lake Okeechobee and so forth, as they drain the lake and drain because of concerns of flooding and hurricanes and so forth, is adding to these pulses of nutrients that are feeding these blooms, which can have a variety of impact. And it's both on the East Coast and the West Coast in southern Florida. The Everglades restoration is extremely important, but I don't think it's going to solve the issues. It still needs to be, you got to limit the source.
Mhm.
And you've got to provide the ability for ecosystems to handle those nutrients. And right now, that's just not the case.
Yeah. All right, we got three more questions. Emily asks that she recently read about a bull shark restoration research project in Kings Bay studying the use of the bay as a bull shark nursery. If the bull shark population increases because of the protection, would that affect the manatees?
I know about this project. I'm fascinated by it. And because, again, as a kid growing up here in Kings Bay in Crystal River, every once in a while we would see a shark up in the bay, and but it was very rare. But now it's not rare at all. They are looking at Kings Bay and Crystal River as a nursery area, as a pupping area for bull sharks. Um, and So there's some evidence for shark predation on manatees. We've seen manatees with shark scars. There actually was a video taken just a few weeks ago, which is gruesome to watch, from Belize, where a tiger shark attacked and killed a manatee. But again, those events, those shark attacks on manatees are very, very few and far between. But it's fascinating because, in my lifetime, and Sylvia's as well, we've seen tremendous changes to these river systems here. Kings Bay and Crystal River, which back in the day was, like I showed in those photographs from the 1960s, was this beautiful, crystal clear, spring-fed river.
That's right.
and freshwater system where now it's more of an estuary. It's more brackish. And that in our lifetime, this whole system has shifted to something that's very different.
Some of it is sea level rise a bit, but it's water drawdown to
Mm,
That's
accommodate
right.
all the primates that
The
have moved into
development.
Florida.
yeah.
That's it. That's exactly right. I mean, the spring flow, many of the springs that I used to love to dive in as a kid are no longer there. And the
Nope.
springs that are there are very, diminished in flow. And that spring where you saw all those manatees, that sanctuary, manatees didn't used to go there.
Huh.
They would go to what's called King Spring, the main spring, which had a lot of spring flow. And those very early photographs that I showed you were taken around that main spring. Now you can't even see your hand in front of you at that spring. But probably why they're going to that spring is it's up a canal, and it's confined, so it's like a bathtub. So that warm water is not getting dispersed
Yeah.
more broadly. It's staying confined, so it's like you going into a warm house, and being able to feel that warmth.
Well, there was a major spring offshore from Miami that has now disappeared, and likely because of the drawdown
With groundwater pumping.
of the groundwater.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of agriculture, but a lot of people too.
Yeah, and it's very noticeable. So if you talk about a restoration project, whether it's nutrients over on the east coast of Florida with those algal blooms, or whether it's the freshwater flow in Kings Bay, Crystal River, it's not right there. It's what's happening somewhere else. It's the extraction from the Florida aquifer. It's the nutrients that are making its way into the aquifer. That water that used to come out of the springs was very pristine, very little nutrients in it. Now there's more, and that again is feeding algal blooms. So it's this cascading effect that we're seeing. I mean, there are now springs that I sit on this springs committee that are reversing flow because there's not enough water pushing, the surrounding water out. So at certain times, there's so little flow that the surface water is making its way down into the aquifer, and that can have a detrimental effect.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
as Lizzie says, water connects us all.
it does.
Yeah. All better.
Absolutely.
So we are a little bit past the top of the hour. So we just wanted to remind people that there are things that they can do in the chat. We've got a couple of places, links to share where you can go and kind of help increase the chances of manatees getting protection.
Yeah, please.
And just thank you so much, Buddy, for taking some time today. And before we close, I just thank the ocean elders and all those of you in the dive-in community that show up and have these conversations with us. Water does connect us all.
Yes.
Indeed. Well, thank you, Sylvia. I appreciate being able to be here this afternoon.
Yeah,
it's
and we'll be back again
privilege.
soon, depending on her travel schedule. And until then, remember, take care of the ocean.
As if your life depends on it, because
It does.
it does.
Thanks again, buddy. See you
Thank
next
you.
time. Bye for now.